Welcome to Health Matters, a health program brought to you by the Farmington Valley Health District. My name's Justine Ginsberg, the Community Health Coordinator for the Farmington Valley Health District, and I'm joined today by Jennifer Katanis, the Health Director of FVHD. It's that time again. One of my labs came in the other morning with a huge tick on his ear, and it's a sure sign that spring is near. And of course, we have to start worrying about those dreaded ticks again. In today's episode, we're going to talk all about ticks, what types are most common in Connecticut, what types of diseases are most commonly associated with ticks, but most importantly, what we can do in our yards and after spending time outdoors to reduce our chances of tick bites. So welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, Justine.
It's a treat for you and I to be on the set at the same time.
It is, absolutely. And I share your story about the dog because my son has a dog and also came in with a tick. So
oh boy.
We know that tick season is here.
So I'm glad we're talking about this today. So we have a large list of questions, and unlike most episodes of Health Matters, we're going to try to get through all of them before we get to the end. So Jennifer, let's start by talking about the types of diseases ticks might carry, as this is, of course, what most people are worried about.
Sure. So obviously Lyme disease is the disease that people most associate with ticks, and rightfully so. It is the disease that is most common in Connecticut. In the Farmington Valley, in the 10 towns that we serve, we have at least 100 cases a year associated, and in all likelihood, this is a far underreporting of the actual number of cases of Lyme disease. And this is in part because it's challenging to diagnose. People may have mild symptoms of the disease, so they never seek treatment or care. And then, of course, even when it is diagnosed, it often is unreported to us. But all the same, we have some of the highest rates of Lyme disease in the state of Connecticut. We have a rate that is 3 times higher than the state average. So it's really something that our residents should be aware of.
And do you think that's put down to the beautiful wooded areas that we have, that we're so lucky?
Sure. I mean, I think in a little bit we'll talk about the types of habitats that we have that are most conducive to ticks and tick-borne, or exposure to ticks. But yes, we have beautiful woodland areas. We happen to have a population that really enjoys the outdoors. We have, large yards, backdoor activity, so all of these things increase the risk of Lyme disease.
All right, so we've talked Lyme disease. What else could I get if I got bitten?
So Lyme disease is spread by the black-legged tick or the deer tick. Also, anaplasmosis and babesiosis are also spread by that same tick. However, they're less common, but you can experience that. Ehrlichia is another tick-borne disease, but that is spread by a lone star tick, and while you can find that in Connecticut, in parts of Connecticut, it really is far less common to hear about people being exposed to and getting Ehrlichia. And then the last one is Rocky Mountain spotted fever. That's transmitted by the American dog tick. You and I know we've got plenty of the American dog ticks around, but again, that's not a common diagnosis either. So really, Lyme disease is the most common. We do see anaplasmosis, babesiosis, and ehrlichiosis, but far less common.
Okay, and we are going to go a little bit later on as we talk a little bit more about what types of ticks and the sizes, etc. But before we do that, let's get a brief overview of what these different illnesses look like.
Sure. So unfortunately, most tick-borne illnesses really have vague symptoms and symptoms that could mirror any other type of illness. So things like fever, fatigue, feeling tired, headaches are all very common in tick-borne illnesses. Some tick-borne illnesses may be also associated with gastrointestinal system symptoms like nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, but again, all of those symptoms could be mistaken for some flu, cold, those types of things. So it can be very difficult to diagnose.
So you can see, a little bit of a raised fever and a little bit feeling a little run down. That could be any number of common childhood illnesses or illnesses that we come across as adults.
Right.
But there is one thing that people talk a lot about, and it's that bullseye rash.
Sure.
Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah. So with Lyme disease in particular, there is often an associated bullseye rash. 70 to 80% of people that are exposed to Lyme disease do develop the rash. So on the one hand, that's good because it could be that telltale sign. It could set apart, you know, the fact that you have these vague symptoms but a rash and maybe some potential exposure to ticks could really, you know, send up a red flag. However, oftentimes the rash might not appear immediately. It may appear anywhere from 2 to 30 days after the tick bite. So the longer it takes for that rash to appear, the less likely you might be to associate it with a tick bite. So that's one of the challenges. The other is for, you know, 20 to 30% of the population that is bitten and exposed but never experiences the rash, you know, again, you're left with the challenge of diagnosis. There are blood tests that can be done. Often we look for the antibodies against whether it's the bacteria or the parasite that is associated with these diseases. The challenge with that is it takes your body time to produce antibodies. When it's been exposed to something, as you know, you're a public health nurse, you could speak to this far better than I.
You're doing a fantastic job.
It does take a period of time. So, for instance, if you if you have a tick bite and you know, you are concerned about that and you go to your doctor and ask for a blood test, it may take a period of time before that blood test shows up positive. So there are protocols and things associated with appropriate laboratory diagnosis. But again, tick-borne illnesses are challenging to diagnose appropriately.
Absolutely, and I think the other thing that when you look at that bullseye rash and you think about these tiny little suckers that attach themselves, sometimes in places you can't see. So if you get bitten between your shoulder blades, unless you spend a lot of time looking at your shoulder blades in the mirror, you mightn't actually see that bullseye rash come up. So, you know, there's, I suppose, that additional layer of it's got to be bitten in an area that you're likely to find the rash if you're in fact one of the percentage of people who are going to actually have it.
Right, and I think the other challenge is that a tick bite is painless. You do not feel, unlike a mosquito or other types of insects that might bite us, you are not likely to feel the bite of a tick at all. So that even doesn't provide an indication.
And for the friends at home, that's because the tick has got this amazing little enzyme in its saliva that actually anesthetizes your skin, so it can be feeding happily there and you don't know it's even there.
Right.
Clever little creatures, aren't they?
Yeah, it's really...
For one so small, their brain is big.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way of putting it.
All right, so we've talked about the vague symptoms. We've talked about the bullseye rash that some people get and some people don't. We've talked about the blood tests. How am I going to be treated if I am diagnosed?
Sure. So antibiotics are recommended for the treatment of Lyme disease, and typically this is doxycycline. The dose and duration really should be discussed in consultation with your doctor. There are recommended treatment regimens for this, but it's antibiotics and again, it's consultation with your physician.
Absolutely, and again, here in Connecticut, we're very fortunate that because ticks are such a big deal, most of your general care practitioners, your emergency room staff, the urgent care clinics, even the little drop-in clinics at the pharmacies, all of the physicians are very well versed in tick bite. Unlike if you came back into my neck of the woods in Australia, you'd probably have a lot of physicians scratching their heads saying, I'm not sure what to do.
Yeah. The other thing that people may not be aware of is Lyme disease got its name because it was originally diagnosed in Lyme, Connecticut. We are extremely fortunate in Connecticut to have the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station. They're an exceptional resource for all things vector-borne, whether it be mosquitoes, ticks, and some really significant research has been done out of our own agency in Connecticut.
So really, you could almost say if you're going to get bitten by a tick, Connecticut's a great place to have it happen.
Right, I guess.
I mean, if there's an upside to being bitten by a tick. So we know that there's challenges in identifying and diagnosing tick-borne diseases. So it appears as though, here's that old public health mantra, it's better to prevent the whole episode than to try to deal with the outcomes. So I know there's that awful moment of horror when we find that tick crawling on us and we think, oh my God, I've got it. I've got Lyme or some other magnificent disease that we've talked about. Can you talk to us a little bit more, that moment we can take a deep breath? What do we need to think about when we see that tick?
Yeah. So I think the first thing to remember is that every tick in Connecticut is not infected. In fact, only about 20% of the black-legged small deer ticks carry Lyme, the Lyme spirochete that transmits the disease.
Okay.
So again, now that can change as many as or up to 40% in some areas may be positive. That depends on the environment and that sort of thing. But, you know, again, the average is 20%. Okay. So, you know, again, 2 out of every 10 ticks. So that reduces your risk of getting Lyme. And then, of course, a tick takes a long time to feed and get a blood meal. And there's been some very good research showing that the length of time that a tick is on you, embedded and actually feeding, is directly correlated with your risk of actually getting the illness. If you get a tick off of you within the first 24 hours, you reduce your risk of getting the Lyme disease in particular to about 0. If it's on you for 48 hours or more, that risk skyrockets dramatically. So really those first 24 to 48 hours are really critical. So 2 things. Most ticks don't carry Lyme, and it takes it a while to transmit the illness once it's bitten you.
And you know, when you look at that tick, I mean, I know when my dog came into the bedroom and he had that tick on his ear, it was engorged. You could see it had blown, its body had blown up, it had been feeding, and it took an awful amount of effort to pull it out. Unlike going hiking the other day with my husband and I had a tick on my leg and it was just wandering up my leg. It clearly hadn't bitten me yet. It was still very small and was able to be removed without any issue at all.
And that's a really important additional part. It cannot transmit the disease just by crawling on you. It really has to bite you and over a period of time transmit that bacterium into your blood system.
Absolutely. So despite the fact that they feel creepy when they're crawling on you, they're actually not going to hurt you in doing that.
Exactly.
All right. So now we have the big tick, small tick debate.
Sure.
Can you tell us a little bit about these little people?
Yeah. So the dog tick is a much larger tick, and I have you probably can't see it, but in this jar, and it is about the size of half an eraser at the end of a pencil. It's much easier to see and identify even in its unengorged state. The challenge with the tick that carries Lyme disease, it is exceedingly small. And the phase of the tick that actually is most likely to transmit disease is not the adult phase, although the female adults can transmit Lyme. It's the nymphal stage, which is even smaller.
Wow.
And so in this jar, I have the very smallest of ticks.
Oh, wow.
They're about the size of the head of a pin.
They're very little.
They're very, very small. And so it's important for 2 reasons. One, if you're concerned about transmission of disease, it's in Connecticut, the deer tick, this exceedingly small tick that is of greater concern than the dog tick. So you want to be able to differentiate the 2. But the size of this tick makes it particularly challenging when we talk about control strategies.
Sure, so that's a great one at home to remember. If you see this tick crawling on you or on your pet, it's probably more than likely going to be a dog tick because it's large enough that you can see it easily. The ones that are the most likely to carry disease are the very, very tiny ones. So, you know, a little harder to see until they've been active.
Yes.
All right. Now we're going to talk prevention.
Sure.
This is what you and I do best. So, public health approach. How do I, first of all, protect myself being bitten, and then how do I protect my home?
Yeah. So The Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station has done a lot of research regarding where ticks are most likely to be found and where people who have gotten Lyme disease were actually exposed. And while ticks are most commonly found in wooded areas because that's where their host, the deer, lives and spends time, unfortunately, the Connecticut Agriculture Experiment Station also recognized that these ticks can be found in our yards. So we really, it's a challenge because what that means is we really have to be careful anytime we spend outside, whether that be in our yard or hiking and spending time in the woods.
Sure.
Of course, your risk is increased when you spend time in the woods because there's far more of them. One of the first things that we can do is protect ourselves with insect repellent. And typically we look for a product that contains 20 to 30% DEET.
Okay.
And when used correctly, and we always recommend people must use this according to the manufacturer's label, DEET is a chemical. If used inappropriately, it can be problematic. But when used appropriately, it can be up to 86 to 92% effective on preventing exposure to ticks. So a really incredibly useful and effective tool. There are ways in which you can use this such that it never gets on your skin. Ticks don't fly, they don't hop, they don't drop from trees. They usually are on blades of grass or brush along, the ground near your lower legs and feet. So even spraying this product on your ankles, your socks, your shoes, below the knee can be a huge deterrent to ticks actually jumping on you and or wanting to stay on you. So using a DEET repellent is a really effective and appropriate strategy.
Okay.
Another thing that people might consider if they tend to spend a lot of time in the woods, so your campers, your hikers, your hunters, there are clothing products that are actually impregnated with a product called permethrin, which is a more natural plant-based insect repellent that comes from the chrysanthemum. And so those products have been shown to be very effective as well in deterring ticks. And if you don't want to spend the money on the actual clothes that have been manufactured with that product, there are products that you can buy in camping supply places, hardware stores. This happens to be one. It's called Clothing and Gear Insect Repellent, and you can spray it on your products yourself.
So like your backpacks, your boots, any of your walking poles, any of those sorts of things that might come in contact with.
And your clothing.
And your clothing as well.
Like socks, socks, the lower legs of your pants, that sort of thing. As with any of these products, you really need to read the manufacturer's instructions, and they have to be reapplied, depending on the product, reapplied periodically to maintain their effectiveness. So insect repellent, certainly important.
Okay.
Wearing light clothes is really helpful. If you have dark socks, dark pants, you're far less likely to identify that a tick is on you. And I know it's not the most attractive thing, but if you can if you're going to be hiking or spending time in the woods, tucking your pants into your socks just presents that natural barrier. A tick may hop from a blade of grass onto your socks, but they're not going to be able to easily, get into or onto your skin if you've got your socks tucked in.
Far more attractive than a bullseye rash on your leg.
That is absolutely the case.
We can make it a new fashion statement. New England fashion.
Right. So, that's funny, but it is absolutely important that we take precautions seriously.
And making sure, even if you weren't if the weather's getting warmer, if you wear long socks and you pull them up, if you're wearing shorts, you're at least protecting that lower part of your leg. Light colored socks, as you said, you're more likely to see these little critters as they're crawling up your light-coloured sock than getting caught in amongst the hairs on your legs. I mean, you think of a man hiking with dark hair on his legs. It's much harder to find that little tick amongst the hair than on a light-coloured sock.
Yeah, and you know, just check periodically, and we'll get into tick checks in a minute. You know, with all of those things, you still might have a tick that somehow gets onto your skin. And really doing, first of all, when you return from spending time in the woods or extended period of time in the yard, if you can remove your clothing and wash it and dry it immediately, that can be really helpful, because ticks will live for a short period of time in your home and seek their next host, be that your pet, an animal, or a family member. Ticks may survive a wash cycle, they may survive the water part, but they're far less likely to survive the heat of a drier cycle. So the washing and the drying are really important if you have ticks on your clothing.
And I suppose making sure too that you take that clothing off in an area that isn't likely to be inhabited by the rest. So if you got undressed in your bedroom, sitting on your bed, you could transfer a tick from your body onto the bed, but if you got undressed in the laundry room and put your clothing straight into the washing machine, you're controlling that environment.
Yeah, to the extent that you can really minimize the opportunity for the ticks to transfer from your clothes onto bedding or anything like that, that's really important.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, so we've talked about ourselves, and obviously tick checks are important.
Tick checks, yeah.
So, you know, love your neighbour, love your hiking partner.
Yeah.
Check, and, you know, remembering maybe you mightn't want to love your neighbour quite that much, but there are other places that ticks like to hide.
Yeah, and the one thing I would just emphasize about the tick checks is do them repeatedly. Given the fact that it does take a tick, you know, 24 to 48 hours before it actually can spread the disease to you, even after it's, you know, embedded and biting, you know, do it repeatedly during those 24 or 48 hours. Really scrub down, you know, with a loofah or you know, a washcloth or something that could remove a tick that's not embedded. And like you said, you know, have a partner check.
Absolutely, and don't forget that ticks like getting into, so underneath your armpits, in the groin area, you know, your belly button, those sorts of places, even at the back of your neck, under your hair. Just be aware of those sorts of places. All right, so we've talked about our body. Let's talk about our environment.
Sure.
What do we do?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, woods where deer live are most likely to have a higher proportion of ticks. However, they can be in our yards. However, they need humidity, high humidity to live. Okay. So they love like leaf litter. So for instance, if we can remove leaf litter as quickly as possible in our yards, under trees, around the perimeter of a wooded area, we potentially reduce their habitat.
Okay.
Keep our lawns cut and manicured. Again, they don't like a lot of sunlight. They do need that moisture, so that's extremely helpful. Restrict ground covers like Pachysandra, where your family might play, because Pachysandra and other ground covers really provide a nice habitat.
Spot to live.
Small mice and chipmunks that live in rock walls, wood piles, are not a host necessarily for the tick, but they are the reservoir for the Lyme disease. So any of those types of habitats, to the extent that you can minimize them, would be great. If you have wood piles, you know, make sure you place them far away from areas where children play or the family spends time, because that can be an area where ticks live. All
right, and as always, we are going to come very close to the end of our show. There's so much to talk about ticks, but I think because both of us have dogs, we probably should just touch on, don't forget those four-legged friends that live in our home. And if you're one of the Ginsburg residents, and I'm sure the Katanis residents as well, four-legged Fido often spends time in bed with us as well.
Yes.
So there are sprays you can use on your dogs. There's internal medications that the dogs can take that repel ticks. There's also collars.
Right.
Ensuring that you've got a good tick treatment for your animal, including your cat.
Yes.
Because they also are those wonderful little vectors that come in and they sit on the sofa and they use the same space that we use. Any more take-home, final 30-second messages?
For the pets, again, they're a great reservoir for bringing those ticks in. There are lots of different products, as you mentioned. You and I discussed what we were using that we found most effective. Consult with their veterinarian, but do use it, and now is the time. Ticks are active in early spring all the way through to early fall, so we need to employ these precautions.
Wonderful. Well, Jennifer, it has been a fantastic treat for you and I to be in the same space rather than one in a booth and one on a set. So as we have discussed, we're entering spring and summer, and it's these months that it is really important that we're vigilant and take the necessary precautions to prevent tick exposure and bites. Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses may be mild, but for some they can be debilitating. Diagnosis of tick-borne diseases can be challenging, as we discussed today, and it may result in delays in getting the appropriate treatment. To reduce your risk, we have outlined things that can be done in your yard to reduce tick populations and personal precautions that everybody should be taking when you're spending time in the glorious outdoors at this time of year. Remember, clothing and repellents can be very effective in preventing tick bites. In addition to doing tick checks regularly, these can significantly reduce the risk of infection. So until next time, remember, your greatest wealth is your health.